I call this module Tainter's Dilemma. An ecological anthropologist named Joseph Tainter wrote a book called The Collapse of Complex Societies. He used Sumer as one of his examples. Sumer was the first civilization, apparently, to develop irrigation. They could make more crops, more rice. With more food, they could have a bigger population. As the irrigation expanded, then they needed new professional talents. They needed surveyors, they needed dike builders, they needed accountants. The resources gained through having such an ample food supply meant that they could support a priestly class, mathematicians, scribes, and of course, the ruling powers. When a society first accesses a new energy source, it exploits it and expands both its population and its complexity. There comes a time, inevitably, when the food supply contracts. In the case of the Sumerians, that contraction occurred because, as a result of the irrigation, the land became salty. The term for it, of course, is salination. So, as the land became salty, the crop yields began to decline. And this is a typical pattern. The resource declines in one way or another. The question is, what do the ruling elites do about that? They're in a bit of a dilemma, because if they don't keep the food supply up, the population will get pretty antsy, huh? So what the Sumerians did was they shifted from one crop a year to 2 crops. This meant that they increased the irrigation. This meant that they increased their rate of salination. And the conclusion was they destroyed their society because they couldn't keep the food supply going. That region of the Middle East is now a desert. So, Joseph Tainter wrote a whole book about it, The Collapse of Complex Societies. The essence of his thesis is that the complexity of all societies is supported by the energy column. So I'm going to reproduce that idea in this little model. So every society, including ours, is based on the physical realities of the land, to a degree forests, what happens with the oceans, and of course, fresh water, and indeed the atmosphere. I mentioned 5 elements, but you get the idea from the 4 that I have here. Our society depends on the energy base that provides us food. Our society, for 200 years or so, has also had access to the stored sunlight of ancient coal and ancient oil. And that energy supply is what allows this extraordinary complexity of the cities we see in Tokyo, Melbourne, London, Japan, huge span of civilization across the whole globe. So these little models at the top, a jet airplane, an apartment building, a car, they represent the physical icons of a complex society. But of course the society has much more. It's got researchers, it's got astronomers, it's got police, it's got sophisticated educational systems. All of these are part of the complexity that are supported by the energy base. Since you who are looking at this doubtless live in this world of complexity that's supported by the energy base, it would be of some interest to you, one would think, to know what's happening to the energy base. Because if the energy base declines, it's going to have severe effects. So we're going to have a little conversation about what's going on in the energy base. Going back to basics. Soil fertility is in decline. It's literally destroyed by industrial agriculture. There's a phenomenon known as ocean acidification, which we'll talk about more a bit later, but ocean acidification means that fish stocks are in jeopardy. They're in jeopardy anyway because of overfishing, but they're also in jeopardy because as the oceans become more acid, the fish will be no longer able to reproduce. Climate change, some assert, is driven by CO2 in the atmosphere. I think that'd be my view as well, but let's not debate it here. And so it goes. It appears as though coal will last for a long time, but it does have environmental effects. There are people who assert that given that not many big oil fields are being discovered, and the ones that are discovered are really hard to reach, and that all the major discovered oil fields are declining, that we've actually reached or near the point of what's called peak oil, when the amount of cheaply available oil begins to decline. The reason to suppose that we've already reached that point is the fact that, at least in Australia, petrol prices have been steadily going up for the last 15 years. There was a time when petrol prices in Australia were around 80 cents a litre. Now they hover around $1.49 or 50 or 60 cents a litre, and occasionally they peak even over that. This is not necessarily just because of market forces or people gaining the market. It's because it actually costs a lot more for the oil companies to produce the oil. This in turn will have economic effects because so much of our society is dependent on transportation, trucks and cars and planes. So if all of the transportation slows down, again, this complexity won't keep up at the same level. And what we'll see is economic decline, which is now being reported on the front pages of the Australian papers. So what we see in the global civilization is that even as we hit ecological limits, the influential powers that be are pushing for economic increase. They're pushing to keep the system going. The Sumerians I don't believe they had a way out once they reached the point of soil salination and high populations. I can't imagine what the power elites could have been done to get themselves out of that situation. We, however, with our design skills, are in a really different situation. We have the skills to redesign everything to vastly reduce the energy requirements and the material requirements to produce enough to live well, not extravagantly, but to live well and indeed to live happily. But there are two things that are missing. The big thing that's missing is the public will to make this happen, and it needs one more thing. The public will, by all of us, to choose to live materially modest lifestyles for the sake of not despoiling the planet for the sake of coming generations, and indeed for our own relatively near-term well-being. You know, there's a saying that what goes up must come down. And I've commented that all societies depend on a column of energy. That could be represented by this. As long as the fountain keeps going, only as long as there's an energy supply from below. If that supply disappears or weakens, you don't get it. That lovely pattern disappears, and by extension, if our energy supply disappears, our fantastically florid, wonderful global civilization will also diminish.